Vanishing Point, a novel by Keith A. Kenel. 5 of 101. Part 5. Sarah carried Skylar's bag into the classroom and placed it in her friend's cubbyhole locker while Skylar headed to the cafeteria for breakfast. By the time Skylar had finished eating and entered her class, all the other students were already at their desks. Skylar managed to walk by Sarah's seat and wiggle her fingers in hello as she snaked her way to her own seat 3 rows over. The girls had sat side by side for a few days when Skylar first started at Interlochen Elementary, but Miss Shannon had separated the girls when, as she'd said, "It just doesn't seem that the two of you can concentrate very well when you're side by side." Skylar wasn't given much opportunity to get comfortable before the morning announcements came on over the intercom. After announcements, the class stood while Miss Shannon led the Pledge of Allegiance, and then sat as she completed her absence and lunch slips. When the slips were complete, she called on the 2 students of the week to tote them to the cafeteria and attendance offices. Finished with preliminaries and ready to start her lessons, she looked up to see Skylar waving her hand in the air. "Yes, Skylar?" Miss Shannon asked. Stacy Shannon was a schoolbook picture of a young Midwestern schoolteacher. She managed to dress primly but not dowdily, having refreshed her pleated maroon skirt and bright white blouse with a steam iron just prior to dressing for work. As a concession to the Florida heat, the woman wore her hair in a loose ponytail, and her freshly scrubbed look gave her charmingly wholesome, if vulnerable, appearance. "I got a note from my mom so I can go home with Sarah after school," the girl said from her seat. "Wonderful," Miss Shannon answered. "Would you bring it to me, please?" Skylar reached into her desk, walked the handwritten note to the front of the room, and stood by Miss Shannon's desk, eyes on the floor, as she handed her teacher the multi-folded slip of paper. It read, "Miss Shannon, Skylar's got my permission to go home with Sarah Cohen after school today. She won't be riding on the bus. Carla Kaiser." Miss Shannon read the dated note that included Carla's phone number, smiled, nodded, and said, "Splendid. Are you spending the night?" Skylar looked up from the floor long enough to nod at her teacher, who smiled, patted the girl's shoulder, and said, "Thank you, Skylar. I hope you have fun. Please return to your seat now." The morning routine rolled along and was punctuated with Mrs. Clark's art class. While Miss Shannon's room was arranged with individual seats in columns and rows, the art room contained large tables where 4 students could sit comfortably and work on large projects. Technically, Skylar and Sarah were not allowed to sit next to one another in art class either, but Mrs. Clark allowed the girls to sit at adjacent tables, which afforded them a limited opportunity to speak with one another. Mrs. Clark had introduced the 3rd graders to the concept of a vanishing point in drawing, and after revisiting the key concepts, the students were now working diligently on their drawings. Skylar set her pencil down, leaned across the gap that separated her from Sarah, and whispered, "I know all about vanishing points. That's what we do when we have to move." Sarah looked up from her project and asked, "Huh?" before returning to her drawing of a railroad track receding into the distance. "We disappear a lot, me and my mom. This is the 6th school I've been to since my daddy died. Mom just says, 'We gotta go, girl.' And next thing I know, we're driving away with our car stuffed all full with whatever we can fit." "Girls," Mrs. Clark asked as she walked toward Sarah and Skylar, "are we walking or chatting?" "Working, Mrs. Clark." Mrs. Clark bent down, lowered her reading glasses from her gray hair to her slightly age-affected, hyperopia-afflicted blue eyes, and picked up first Skylar's and then Sarah's papers. "Nice work, ladies. It looks like you have a fine understanding of Vanishing Point. But I shouldn't be hearing a lot of chatter right now," she added, looking down her nose and over her glasses at the 2 girls. "No, ma'am," Sarah said, turning her head to her friend and shaking it. Mrs. Clark smiled, patted Sarah on the shoulder, and walked to another table to check the progress of other students. Once the art teacher had moved away, Sarah hissed, "Don't get us in trouble, Skylar. We can talk at lunch." "Okay," her friend responded a bit loudly. "I just don't like the idea of vanishing, that's all."